She was 20 years old and for all practical purposes homeless. Her uncle had dismissed her with 75 and a final, clipped sentence that was more of a ledger closing than a farewell. She had no family left to turn to, no clear plan, and only one object of any real meaning. Her father's brass pocket compass, heavy and cool in her palm. And, with 70 of that final sum, she bought a derelict steamship, the Starlight Queen, stranded in the parched, sun-bleached basin of Saltwash, a town 50 miles from the nearest navigable water. But what nobody in Saltwash knew, what the land agent who sold it for back taxes had long forgotten, was that locked away in the captain's cabin was a secret that would change not only her life, but the future of the forgotten town itself. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from as we tell the story of Mabel Thornton and the ship that became her world. Mabel's life had been shaped by the contrary forces of steam and ink. Her father, Thomas Thornton, was a riverboat engineer, a man who spoke the language of boilers and pistons, whose hands were permanently stained with grease, and whose heart was full of the river's nomadic freedom. He smelled of hot metal and coal smoke, and he had taught Mabel the beauty of a well-seated gasket and the precise tolerance of a polished brass fitting. He believed the world was a magnificent machine, and that understanding how it worked was a form of reverence. Before he was lost to a boiler explosion when she was 12, he had given her the compass. "So you always know your heading, May," he'd said, his voice a low rumble, even when the river bends. Her mother had passed, years before that, a quiet, fading from consumption that left Mabel with only a vague memory of lavender scent and a gentle hand on her forehead. After her father's death, she was sent to live with his only living relative, his older brother, Silas. Silas Thornton was a man of ink. He was a merchant in a small, prosperous town, a man who believed the world was a ledger book of profit and loss, and that understanding its cold arithmetic was the only virtue that mattered. He took Mabel in, not out of affection, but out of a grudging sense of duty, a debt he felt was owed to the family name. She was an entry in his accounts, an expense to be managed. She worked in his mercantile, her quiet competence, a stark contrast to the loud, boastful manner of her cousins. She swept the floors, stalked the shelves, and soon Silas discovered her sharp mind and steady hand were perfect for his ledgers. She learned the language of his world, too. Accounts receivable, inventory, cost of goods, sold. But she never forgot her father's language. In the evenings, she would study the engineering schematics he had left her, intricate drawings of steam engines and paddle wheel assemblies. While her uncle saw only a dependent, her father had seen a partner, a mind as curious and capable as his own. She carried his compass in her apron pocket always, its weight a constant grounding presence. It was a connection to a world where value was measured not in dollars, but in craftsmanship, in the elegant and powerful logic of a machine built to master the current. This quiet, dual education in mechanics and commerce made her observant, patient, and deeply self-reliant, qualities her uncle never recognized and certainly never valued. He saw only a quiet girl who cost him money, unaware that he was housing the one person who truly understood the foundations of the world he profited from. The end of her time in Silas Thornton's house came as quietly as it had begun. It was not a shouting match or a dramatic scene, but a simple administrative decision delivered across the polished surface of his oak desk. His eldest son, Walter, was getting married, and the bride's family was of some standing. A place had to be made for the new daughter-in-law, both in the household and in the business. Mabel was, in the cold calculus of her uncle's world, a redundant asset. He called her into his office one Tuesday morning, the air thick with the smell of leather and old paper. He did not ask her to sit. He stood behind his desk, his hands clasped behind his back, looking not at her, but at a point on the wall just over his shoulder. "Mabel," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Walter is to be wed next month. His wife, Eleanor, will be taking over the household accounts and assisting in the store. Your room will be needed for them." He paused, letting the words settle in the silent room. I have determined that your services are 5 menu tests no longer required. He slid a small, thin envelope across the desk. This is 75. It represents a final settlement. For your years of work, I consider it a generous amount. It was not a negotiation. It was a pronouncement. Mabel looked at the envelope, then back at his impassive face. She saw no malice there, but also no warmth, no flicker of familial connection. She was a line item being closed out. She had known this day would come in one form or another. She had been living on borrowed time, a guest in a house that had never felt like a home. She did not plead or argue. To do so would have been to show a vulnerability he would neither understand nor respect. She simply nodded once. I understand, she said, her own voice as steady as his. She took the envelope. She went upstairs to the small attic room that had been hers for 8 years and packed her few belongings into a single carpet bag, 2 worn dresses, a change of underthings. Her father's schematics rolled and tied with a bit of twine, and a small bag of tools she'd carefully accumulated. She left the quilt on the bed, the book on the nightstand. They belonged to the house, not to her. As she walked down the stairs, she paused and looked at the family portraits on the wall. Her father was not among them. It was as if he, and by extension she, had never really been there at all. She closed the front door behind her without a sound, the compass in her pocket, a solid, reassuring weight against her leg. The journey had begun. The stagecoach ride west was a trial of dust and endurance. Mabel sat by the window, watching the familiar green hills of her uncle's valley flatten into rolling plains and then bleach into the harsh, cracked earth of the Great Basin. The world outside became a study in beige and ochre, the sky a vast and different blue. Dust seeped through the window frames, coating her dress, her hands, her eyelashes with a fine, gritty powder. It worked its way into the back of her throat, and she sipped sparingly from her canteen, making the water last. The other passengers were strangers, a collection of weary prospectors and a stern-faced woman with 2 small children, all of them retreating into their own private miseries. As the miles wore on, Mabel remained in her own quiet bubble of observation, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She thought not of what she had lost, for one cannot truly lose what one never possessed, but of what lay ahead. At a dusty way station, she'd seen a handbill advertising land parcels in a place called Saltwash, a town founded on the shores of a river that had, in a fit of geological caprice, vanished 20 years prior, leaving the settlement high and dry. The notice mentioned unclaimed properties sold for the cost of back taxes. The name stuck in her mind, a place defined by its own abandonment. It seemed fitting. After 3 days of travel, the coach crested a low-rise, and the driver called out Stwash. Below them, nestled in a wide, shimmering salt flat, was the town. It was exactly as she had imagined, a handful of sun-scoured wooden buildings huddled together, as if for comfort against the immense emptiness. The streets were wide and silent, and a fine white dust lifted with every gust of wind, tasting of salt and alkali. But the most astonishing feature, the one that made her sit up straight, was the ship. There, on the edge of town, perched on a dry bank overlooking the ghost of the riverbed, sat a full-sized paddly steamship. It was a monument to a forgotten promise, its white paint peeling, its twin smokestacks stark against the sky. It was absurd, magnificent, and utterly abandoned. The coach rolled to a stop in front of a building marked with a faded sign. Saltwash Land Office. Mabel gathered her bag, paid the driver the last of her fare, and stepped out into the blinding sunlight. The air was hot and still. She walked toward the office, her destination clear in her mind. The ship called to something deep within her, a strange echo of her father's world, stranded in her uncle's. It was a broken thing, a forgotten ledger entry, a machine with no purpose. It was, she thought with a flicker of grim humor, just like her. The land office was a single dusty room presided over by a man named Alistair Abernathy, a weirl. looking individual with a green eye shade and ink stains on his cuffs. He looked up from his paperwork as Mabel entered, a flicker of surprise in his eyes at the sight of a young woman alone. "Help you?" he asked, his voice dry as the air outside. "I'm here about the unclaimed properties," Mabel said, her voice clear and steady. "Specifically, the steamship." Abernathy leaned back in his chair, a slow, incredulous smile spreading across his face. "The Starlight Queen. Honey, that ain't property. That's a landmark, a monument to bad planning." He chuckled to himself. The saltwash Folly River dried up in '68. Left her sitting right where she is now. Been there 20 years. Mabel met his gaze without flinching. "Is there a deed? Is it for sale?" Her directness seemed to disarm him. He shuffled through a stack of brittle papers in a large wooden file box. "Let's see. Ah, here she is. Starlight Queen. Property of the defunct Saltwash Steam Navigation Company. Reverted to the county for 19 years of unpaid taxes." He squinted at the ledger. "Total due, including fees and interest, 70. He looked at her, a speculative glint in his eye. "You got 70? Mabel placed the bills from her uncle's envelope on the desk. 7 crisp 10 notes. Abernathy stared at the money, then at her, then back at the money. He shrugged. "Well, I'll be. It's your money." He filled out the transfer of deed with a scratchy pen, his movements slow and deliberate. He sanded the ink, stamped it with a heavy seal, and pushed the document across the desk. "She's all yours, miss. Hull, boilers, paddle wheel, and all the dust and rats therein. Good luck to you." Mabel folded the deed and placed it in her bag. She walked out of the office and toward the ship, the legal owner of the largest, most useless object in the entire basin. As she drew closer, its scale was immense. The hull rose a good 30 feet from the ground, its timbers bleached gray and cracked like old bone. The name Starlight Queen was still visible in faded gold leaf on the bow. She found the gangplank miraculously still intact and walked up onto the main deck. The wood groaned under her weight. Dust lay thick as a blanket over everything. On the upper deck, she peered through the grimy windows of the Grand Saloon, seeing the ghosts of velvet-covered chairs and brass lamps. She made her way to the stern to the engine room access. The hatch was stiff, but she managed to pry it open. She climbed down the iron ladder into the heart of the vessel. And there, surrounded by the silent, massive forms of the twin boilers and the great sleeping piston arms, she felt the first true stirring of something like hope. The machinery was covered in dust and cobwebs, but it was fundamentally sound. The iron was pitted, but not rusted through. The brass fittings were tarnished, but solid. It was a language she understood. It was her father's world. This was not a folly. It was a fortress. It was a home waiting to be awakened. The first week aboard the Starlight Queen was a battle against 2 decades of neglect. Mabel's initial task was simply to make a small corner of the first special habitable. She chose a small steward's cabin on the main deck, one with a window that faced east to catch the morning sun. The door hung on one hinge, and the glass was gone from the window, but it was a space she could claim. Her days fell into a rhythm of relentless, methodical work. She spent the first 2 days just sweeping, pushing out mountains of dust, dirt, and the desiccated remains of long-dead creatures. She used a piece of sailcloth she found in a storage locker to patch the window, creating a translucent barrier that let in light, but kept out the worst of the wind. She repaired the door hinge with a piece of wire and 14 minutes now. Her small collection of tools proving invaluable. Water was the most pressing concern. The town well was a 4-mile walk, and she made the trip twice a day with 2 large buckets she'd found in the ship's galley. The journey back a slow, careful plod to avoid spilling a single precious drop. She learned to be frugal with it, using 1 portion for drinking and cooking and reusing the gray water to wash the floors. She found a small pot-bellied stove in the galley. Its flue pipe rusted through in several places. She spent an entire day carefully disassembling it, cleaning each part, and patching the pipe with strips of tin cut from an old crate. That evening, for the first time, she lit a small fire, the scent of burning Moe's quite filling her small cabin with a warm, comforting glow. It was a profound victory, a small pocket of civilization carved out of the dereliction. Her attention, however, was repeatedly drawn to the captain's cabin. It was situated at the forward end of the upper deck, part of the pilot house, commanding the best view of the dry riverbed. Its door was made of solid oak and was locked fast. The brass keyhole was dark and impenetrable. She tried the few skeleton keys she found on a ring in the galley, but none would turn the lock. She examined the hinges, but they were heavy-duty strap hinges bolted from the inside. There was no simple way in. Curiosity gnawed at her, but it was more than that. The cabin represented the ship's command center, its brain. It felt incomplete, unsettled to have it sealed off. More practically, it was the most secure room on the ship, the most defensible. One afternoon, after securing her own small space, she decided she would get in one way or another. She brought her tools to the upper deck. First, she tried to pick the lock using a thin piece of wire and a 16-minute small tension wrench she fashioned from a nail. She had watched her father do this once on a stubborn toolbox. She worked patiently for over an hour, feeling the faint clicks of the pins, but the mechanism was seized with rust and time. It wouldn't yield. Frustrated, but not defeated, she shifted her strategy. She would not break the door, but she would unmake it. She would remove the lock itself. The lock set was held in place by 2 large screws, their slots so clogged with grime and tarnish. She had to spend carefully scraping them clean. With her largest screwdriver, she put her entire weight into it, turning with slow, steady pressure. The metal groaned in protest. The first screw turned a fraction of an inch, then another. It took her nearly an hour of straining effort. Her knuckles raw, but finally both screws were out. She carefully worked the brass lock set out of its mortise. With a final clunk, it came free. The door swung inward with a low, mournful creak, opening the room to the light for the first time in 20 years. The air that billowed out of the captain's cabin was stale and dry, carrying the scent of old paper and sun-baked wood. A fine, pale dust coated every surface, preserving the room as a perfect tableau of its last moments of use. A sturdy oak desk stood against the far wall, a captain's chair before it. On the desk sat a heavy logbook bound in dark leather, lying open. A brass oil lamp, its glass chimney miraculously intact, stood beside it. To the left was a narrow cot, its blanket folded with military precision. To the right stood a large iron-banded sea chest. Mabel stepped inside, her boots making soft prints in the dust. She ran her hand over the desk, the wood smooth and cool beneath the grime. She walked over to the logbook and gently brushed the dust from its pages. The ink was faded but legible, written in a strong, clear hand. The entries chronicled the final, feudal weeks of the Starlight Queen's life on the water. May 10th, 1868. Water leveled down another 4 inches. Ran ground twice today. Had to winch her off the sandbar. The river is dying. The final entry was dated June 1st, 1868. Tied her up at the salt wash landing for the last time. The company has dissolved. The passengers are gone. I am. All that remains. The river is gone. God help us. It was signed, Captain Elias Vance. Mabel felt a strange kinship with this long-dead captain. Another soul left behind by a world that had moved on. Without him, she began to clean the cabin, not with the frantic energy of her first days, but with a quiet reverence. As she was wiping down the heavy oak desk, she noticed something peculiar about its construction. It was a simple, functional piece, but the front panel beneath the main drawer seemed to be made of a different grain of wood, a subtle mismatch that only a careful eye would catch. She ran her fingers along its edge. There was no handle, no seam. She pushed on it first gently, then with more force. Nothing. She examined the drawers. There were 3, all of which she had opened and found empty, but the depth of the drawers didn't seem to match the depth Of the desk itself, there was a void, a hidden space. She returned to the front panel and began tapping it lightly, listening to the sound. Most of it was a dull thud, but near the right side, the sound was slightly more hollow. She pressed firmly in that spot. She felt a faint click, a release of tension, and a section of the panel, no bigger than a book, swung inward on a hidden hinge. Inside the dark cavity was a small oilcloth-wrapped bundle and a neatly stacked pile of banknotes held together by a leather strap. Her heart hammered in her chest. With trembling hands, she lifted the money. It was a mix of federal notes and gold certificates. She counted it slowly, her lips moving silently. It came to 3,000, a fortune, more money than she had ever imagined seeing in one place. Beneath it lay the oilcloth package. She untied the twine and unrolled it. Inside was a letter, the paper yellowed, but perfectly preserved, and a small object, a little bird carved from a single piece of driftwood, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. She picked up the letter. The same strong, clear hand that had filled the logbook addressed it simply. To whomever finds this, she sat in the captain's dusty chair and began to read. The words of Captain Elias Vance filled the silent cabin, a voice reaching across 2 decades of silence. If you are reading this, then you have found my last port of call. You have likely also found my ship, a monument to a river that forgot its own course. My name is Elias Vance, and I was her captain for 10 years. I write this not out of despair, but out of a sliver of hope. Mabel read on, her breath held tight in her chest. The company went bankrupt when the water disappeared. They paid me what little they had and left the ship to me as my final severance. I had planned to sell her for scrap to take my family west of the coast, but there were no buyers. No one wanted a steamship in the middle of a new desert. My wife Sarah and our daughter Lily were with me in Saltwash. We were waiting for the spring thaw, hoping it might raise the water enough to move the Queen downstream, but the thaw never came. Instead, a fever came through the town that winter. It took them both within a week of each other. Lily was only 6. Mabel stopped reading, her fingers tracing the smooth wood of the carved bird. It was a child's toy, a small, simple thing imbued with an impossible weight of love and loss. She continued reading the letter. After they were gone, I had nothing left to go west for. This ship was my last connection to the life I had known. I stayed. I worked odd jobs in the town, but I lived aboard the Queen. I kept her as best I could. The money you have found is every dollar I saved in my life. It is the wages from 10 years on the river and the small earnings from my time here. It is not a king's ransom, but it is a stake. It is enough to start something. I have no kin to leave it to. So, I leave it to you, whoever you are. I leave it to the person with enough patience and vision to find value in what everyone else has abandoned. Use it well. Perhaps you can make this place live again, or perhaps it will be your passage to a better one. That is for you to decide. All I ask is that you remember that a man named Elias Vance loved his family and loved this ship. The letter was signed simply Captain Vance. Mabel folded the letter fully and placed it back in its oil sheath. She looked around the cabin at the desk, the cot, the logbook. It was no longer just an empty room. It was a trust. The 3,000 was not a treasure she had found, but an inheritance she had been given. She picked up the carved bird and held it in one hand, and from her pocket she took out her father's brass compass and held it in the other. One was a guide to the world, the other a reminder of what made a place a home. She would not be leaving Saltwash. Captain Vance had left her a stake, and she would honor his hope. She would make this place live again. The Starlight Queen would have a new purpose. The captain's inheritance changed everything. It was not just money. It was possibility. It was the means to turn survival into a future. For 2 days, Mabel did nothing but plan. She sat at Captain Vance's desk with paper and a pencil, sketching, calculating, and thinking. She would not just live in the ship, she would transform it. Saltwash, for all its desolation, was on a crossroads. Prospectors, surveyors, and traders passed through, but there was no respectable place for them to stay, only a rowdy saloon with a few grimy rooms above it. The Starlight. Queen would become the Starlight Inn, a clean, safe boarding house. The cavernous engine room, with its high ceilings and sturdy iron foundations, would become her workshop, a place for repairing wagons, tools, and whatever machinery found its way to her. It was an ambitious plan, one that would require immense labor. With the captain's money carefully secured, she walked into town and began to purchase supplies. She bought lumber from the town's small, struggling mill, panes of glass from the general store, nails, screws, paint, and gallons of linseed oil. The townsfolk watched her with quiet curiosity, their initial amusement at the girl who bought the folly turning into a grudging respect as they saw the sheer volume of materials she was hauling back to the ship load by load in a hired buckboard. Her first major project was to make the vessel entirely weatherproof. She started on the upper deck, methodically replacing every broken window, carefully scraping out the old hardened putty and setting the new panes of glass with fresh glazing points. It was slow, exacting work. Then, she turned her attention to the deck itself. The planks were sun-bleached and shrunken, with gaps between them that let in wind and dust. She bought barrels of pine tar and spent a week on her hands and knees, laboriously caulking every seam with oakum and sealing it with a hot, sticky tar, the same way her father had taught her sailors waterproof their ships. The work was grueling, but with each sealed seam, the ship felt more solid, more whole. It was during this work that she had her first real interaction with one of the townspeople, an old man named Jedediah Croft, the town's semi-retired carpenter. Stopped by one afternoon, his hands tucked into the bib of his overalls. He watched her for a long time, his brow furrowed. "You're using ship's caulking," he finally said, his voice a growly rasp. "That's right," Mabel replied, not stopping her work. She was a ship. She deserves to be treated like one. A slow smile cracked his weathered face. "That she does," he pointed with his chin toward a section of a railing that was sagging. "That post is rotten at the base. You need to brace it before you put any weight on it." The next morning, he returned with a solid piece. 27 minutes soft oak and his own tools. "Figured you could use this," he said, and he showed her how to cut a mortise and tenon joint to secure the new post, a skill far beyond her own knowledge. He asked for nothing in return. He was the first. A few days later, Martha Paisley, the baker's wife, a stout woman with kind eyes, came up the gang plank carrying a covered basket. "I see your lamp burning late every night," she said, her voice warm. "A body can't live on hard work alone." Inside the basket was a loaf of fresh bread, a crock of butter, and a thick slice of apple pie. From then on, Martha came by twice a week, always with some offering from her kitchen. She never stayed long, but her quiet, steady generosity was a balm to Mabel's solitude. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place when she began work on the engine room. She needed to fabricate a new hinge for the massive cargo door, a piece of ironwork that required a forge. She went to the blacksmith, Samuel Finch, a young man with powerful arms and a serious demeanor. She brought one of her father's old schematics to show him the precise design she needed. He looked at the drawing, his professional eye, appreciating the clean lines and detailed measurements. "Your father was an engineer," he stated, not a question. "He was," Mabel said. Samuel nodded. "I can make this, but it would be better if you helped. You know what it needs to do." For the next 2 days, she worked alongside him at the forge, learning the rhythm of the hammer, the smell of hot iron, the critical moment to quench the steel. He charged her only for the cost of the iron. Through these small, repeated acts of practical help, a community began to form around her. They were not friends in the conventional sense. They did not share stories or secrets. They shared work. They recognized in her a spirit of industry and self-reliance. They valued in themselves. They saw she wasn't just fixing a ship. She was building a life, and they offered in their own quiet ways the tools to help her do it. Months turned into a year. The Starlight Queen was reborn. A new coat of white paint gleamed in the desert sun. Her trim, picked out in a smart navy blue, The name on her bow was railed, a splash of gold against the stark landscape. On the main deck, 4 of the old cabins had been converted into clean, simple, comfortable rooms for lodgers, each with a freshly glazed window, a sturdy bed, and a small wood stove, the grand saloon. Its faded velvet replaced with durable canvas and polished wood, now served as a common room and dining hall. Below, the engine room was transformed. The dormant machinery, cleaned and oiled, stood as silent, magnificent sculptures of iron and brass. The rest of the space was an efficient workshop, organized with benches, tools, and a small forge that Samuel Finch had helped her build. The Starlight Inn and Repair was open for business. Her name, Mabel Thornton, became known throughout the basin. People started calling her Miss Mabel, the proprietor of the inn. Her first guest was a geologist from the State Survey who stayed for a month and paid her in gold. He was followed by a circuit judge, a pair of trappers, and a family heading west who needed their wagons axle repaired. They came for the clean rooms, the good, simple food that Mabel cooked in the galley kitchen, and her growing reputation as a skilled mechanic. Her life settled into a new, satisfying rhythm. She rose before the sun, the first light finding her in the galley, starting the fire in the big cook stove. The smell of coffee and bacon would drift out across the silent town, a signal that the day had begun. Jedediah Croft, the old carpenter, took to coming by for coffee every morning, sitting with her in the saloon as they watched the sunrise paint the salt flats in shades of pink and orange. Martha Paisley supplied the inn with all its bread and pastries, and they would trade a room for her visiting cousin in exchange for a month's worth of baking. Samuel Finch used Mabel's workshop for larger projects that wouldn't fit in his own smithy. The ship was no longer an object of ridicule, but the quiet, beating heart of the town's commerce and social life. It was a place of rest, of repair, of community. Children from the town would sometimes come and play on the lower deck, and Mabel would let them, showing them how the great paddle pistons worked, telling them stories of the river that used to be. She was no longer the outcast, the solitary girl with 75. She was a fixture, a respected business owner, a part of the fabric of Saltwash. The town, once defined by what it had lost, was slowly being redefined by what had been built in its place. The Starlight Queen had finally found its permanent and most important port of call. One evening in late autumn, as the desert air grew crisp and the sky deepened to a bruised purple, Mabel stood on the captain's walk outside the pilot house. She looked out over the town of Saltwash. Lights glowed in the windows of the small houses and the general store, warm and inviting against the vast, dark expanse of the basin. The lamps of her own cast a welcoming pool of light onto the ground below, where a traveler's wagon was parked for the night. A thin curl of smoke rose from the saloon's chimney, and she could hear the faint sound of a piano. The town was quiet, but it was alive. She had been here for nearly 2 years. She went inside into the captain's cabin, 33 minutes which was now her office and private sitting room. A fire crackled in the small stove, casting a warm light on the polished wood of the desk. She sat in Captain Vance's chair, its wood worn smooth by years of use. On the corner of the desk, 2 objects sat side by side. One was her father's brass compass, its needle pointing faithfully north. The other was Captain Vance's carved wooden bird, its wings forever poised for flight. She thought of the 2 men she had never been able to say a proper goodbye to. Her father, Thomas Thornton, who had given her the skills to understand the world and a tool to find her way in it, and Captain Elias Vance, a man she had never met, a stranger bound to her by a shared experience of loss and a common love for a stranded ship. He had given her a stake, but more than that, he had given her a purpose, a legacy to honor. She thought for a fleeting moment of her Uncle Silas. She felt no anger, no bitterness, only a kind of distant sorrow for a man who lived in a world so small he could measure it with numbers. He had dismissed her with 75, a sum he believed would erase her from his life. He could never have imagined what that pottery some could build. He saw value only in what could be bought and sold, and had cast away both a person and a place he deemed worthless. And from those two discarded things, she had built this entire world. Mabel Thornton was 20 years old when she arrived in Saltwash with almost nothing. She had spent 70 on a derelict steamship 50M from the water. It was the best 70 she ever spent. It had bought her more than a home. It had bought her a life. If Mabel's story of finding a home in the most unlikely of places moved you, consider subscribing for more tales of resilience and discovery. We believe that value can be found in the most forgotten corners and strength in the quietest hearts. And now we'd like to leave you with a question to carry into your week. What forgotten thing in your own life or in your own community might hold a hidden value just waiting for a second look? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for being here with